The topic of the lecture today is Roma knowledge production, examining the critical turn in Romani studies. During the next 25 minutes or so, I'm aiming to briefly look at and examine some of the key shifts that we've seen in how knowledge production in Romani studies and other discipline areas has shifted, changed and transformed during the last few years. For ease of reference, and to focus on the contemporary movements, I'm going to draw on the last 30 years. Indeed, I don't see any reason to dwell on earlier times, as I believe that Dr. Adrian Marsh and other colleagues have done an excellent job of covering much of that groundwork concerning the historical aspects as part of this ERIAC lecture series. But, in many ways, this session does dovetail rather nicely with Adrian's earlier talk, as well as some of the critical and engaged work of the panellists who are gathered here today to discuss the issues arising from the lecture. To keep things manageable, the lecture is split into three connected sections. The first section, I'm going to define key terms of reference for the lecture, just to be clear about what we're speaking about, but also, as importantly, what we're not speaking about. I will also say something about how we understand knowledge production, and in particular what we mean by Roma knowledge production. I think it's important to be precise about what we're discussing. Then, in the second section, I will outline what I think to be, and what is, the critical turn within Roma knowledge production and in Romani studies more broadly. We can sketch a few different pathways here and how these relate to wider processes of decolonisation in academic research studies and intersectional approaches in the broader academic curriculum. This is not just a North American phenomena or concern, but very much a European one as well. This critical turn has not been without controversy, and it's also divided opinions, as we'll see. The final and last section of the lecture will consider the contemporary situation and how, in the context of Black Lives Matter, the Me Too movement, and other such campaigns and activism, Romani studies as a discipline, as a subject matter, needs to respond and offer solidarity. Further, I want to spend a little time looking at how Roma knowledge production is having to adapt in times of COVID-19. How has the shift to even more digital methods and ways of online working impacted on knowledge production, activism and scholarship? I hope this structure seems appropriate for the lecture, and I'm looking forward to an exchange of views after. Section 1. Defining our terms. When we use or hear the term knowledge production, what do we think of? For me, right now, I'm actually thinking of the 13 lectures that have preceded this one. This online lecture series has vividly illustrated impressive and unique evidence of distinct and specialised kinds of knowledge production. So, whether it's been historiography, language, identity, slavery, anti-Gypsyism, the Holocaust, life under communism, political activism, feminism, the performing arts, dance, the history of art, and music. These wonderfully eclectic but connected topics have reflected and been underlined by lived Rromani experience as much as intellectual knowledge in and of itself. It is Rromani knowledge as Rromani experience. It is, if you like, a form of Rromanipen with a collective higher degree or a PhD after its name. So we might say that a vital constituent part of knowledge production is the lived experience of how such knowledge arises and is created in the first place, what shapes it, what defines it, what surrounds it. At a more fundamental basis, knowledge production, for my mind, is really two key things. One, it's the theoretical and practical understanding of a particular subject or topic. That's the knowledge part of the expression. But also, more importantly, and secondly, It's the decisions, the activities, and the consequences of enabling and actioning such knowledge. That's the production part of the expression. So when you take those together, we can then define knowledge production as the theoretical and practical awareness of any given topic and the acts of making that knowledge useful and meaningful in public and private spaces. It's about, in a sense, it's about having access to the means of production in quite a literal sense. And so therefore, to talk about Rroma knowledge production is to talk about Rroma having a sense of control in a just, transparent and democratic manner, ideally, over such inquiry and organisation. This is another reason why, I would argue, that the ERIAC lecture series is a really useful and topical example of Rroma knowledge production. This has been largely designed, planned, enacted, produced, delivered and heard by the communities it directly discusses and claims to speak of and in the name of. The series is also a good example of the values and spirits of co-production, of allyship, of solidarity, both between and within different Rromani groups and scholars, and also their supporters. Having now identified the key terms of reference, we can now take a move into the second part of the lecture, which is looking at the notion of a critical turn in Rromani studies and what this means. Section 2, a critical turn. In this next section of the lecture, I want to look at the notion of a critical turn in Rromani studies. But again, definitions are really important here. So what do we actually mean by a critical turn, and what might incorporate and make up Rromani studies? In academic thinking, the most obvious or straightforward way of examining a supposed critical turn in any discipline is to think about what's often referred to as a paradigm shift. That is, a fundamental change and disruption in how we approach a given topic or issue, and challenging and problematising previously underlying assumptions about that topic. Now, it would seem to me, certainly over the last 30 years or so, that a convincing and persuasive argument can be made to suggest that this critical turn or a paradigm shift has occurred in the broad area of Rromani studies. And for reasons of clarity, I will also define here Rromani studies as including those academic, often interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary studies, the projects, the writings, the recordings, the performances that have at their centre a concern or interest in the lives, experiences, situations and thoughts of communities otherwise known as Roma, Sinti, Gypsies, Travellers, Gitano, Manouche, and many, many other labels and categories besides. Again, we can look at the topic and areas covered by the previous lectures that make up this ERIAC series to get a real sense of what's relevant and what's important just now within the academic discipline. It's been a presentation of the cutting edge research. However, a critical turn does seem to imply a move away from particular modes of thinking that are perhaps otherwise staid or conservative or conventional or descriptive rather than analytical. So a critical turn is about examining issues that may have previously been investigated or those that have just been ignored in new, creative and imaginary ways. It's about deconstruction and new analysis and critique. It's about a shifting of the pendulum. It's about searching for new truths and new meanings. It's about, as has been argued, seeing Rromani studies through Rromani eyes, the title of a book produced and edited by Delane Labat and Thomas Acton. So has this been the case in Rromani studies? I would suggest the answer is yes. There is evidence of this shift in at least three main ways that I've witnessed over the last 30 years. The first of those, I think, is the new generation of younger and older Rromani scholars and activists who have PhDs, who have skilled CVs, who are multilingual and possess a public confidence and assertiveness in their unique skill sets that have broken through into the field of Romani studies. They've got new ideas that deserve to be heard and deserve to be debated. Indeed, without wishing to embarrass anyone, some of those very individuals that I'm thinking of have presented at this ERIAC lecture series. And this emergence into the field of Romani studies is being developed, consolidated, and internationally established. It's a visible display of the post-colonial turn. That is, the belief and the practice of nothing about us without us. I think the second shift or difference that can be noted is that there's now new forms and modes of writing and publication and performance forums for discussing debates and issues that are central to Romani studies. They focus and prioritise Romani knowledge production. The most obvious example, I think, that we can look to is the innovative work coming out of CEU in Budapest and Vienna, and the summer schools, the conferences, the fellowships, the journal, Critical Romani Studies. All these, I think, are indicators of these new forms and modes of performance and of writing and publication space. These opportunities give voice and space to Romani experience and knowledge that has not been previously available. Now, such efforts did not just create space at an existing gadget table for discussion and debate, but actually it's led to the construction of new tables entirely. They are new Romani tools for new Romani houses, we might say, thinking of Audre Lorde. The third shift I think we can see over the last 3 decades or so has been renewed academic interest in forms of Roma knowledge production that were previously silenced, ignored, or written only about by non-Roma, by gadget, by settled people, by flatties, and often in ways that the subject of such knowledge production would not even recognise within themselves. What I mean here by this is, surely the ultimate test of a good ethnographer, for example, is a recognition by the community being studied and worked with that this is a book or an article that offers a fair and accurate representation of themselves and their lives, warts and all. Sometimes it reveals uncomfortable truths, but there is at least a recognition of self and selves within the narrative. But the fundamental change here is that the authors of such work, for example on traveller stories or art, dance songs, poetry, and so much more, they've been incorporated in a quite literal and epistemological sense into the heart of Romani studies. It's not bias, it's not subjectivity, but rather it's insights and it's insider appreciation. This is really important when thinking about, for example, some of the work in Scotland by Betsy White, by Sheila Stewart, Jess Smith, Stanley Robertson, Jeannie Robertson, and so many other Scottish travellers. Combining all 3 of these aspects, I think we can argue that the critical turn is in fact a paradigm shift, or a series of shifts. It's plural rather than singular. And they challenge previously held truths about what constitutes the broad area and concerns of Romani studies as a discipline. It's necessitated theoretical, conceptual, methodological, and a practical turn of the head. It is, in a very real sense, a new type of self-gaze. It's a reimagined focus. Fundamentally, it's called for a re-evaluation of the science of knowledge in Romani production. What is valued, what's not? What is seen through Romani eyes, what's understood? It is, in short, an epistemological and ontological 21st century Roma revolution. This has not been welcomed by everyone. Some critics, and there have been a few, have both agreed and disagreed that a paradigm shift might have occurred within Romani studies. For some, the shift has happened, it might have occurred, but this is taking us towards what the anthropologist Michael Stewart has termed a closed society research paradigm, and this insular approach should concern us, he argues. Likewise, other critics, such as Yaron Matras, have argued quite loudly and quite visibly that this critical turn has actually not been established. It's not as claimed. And in fact, this critical turn, all it amounts to in practice, is a rejection of science. It's a rejection of truth and objectivity. And what it is, it's a privileging of politics, of identity, of propaganda and subjectivity. In a sense, it is about knowing your place. It's about being rendered as object and being subject to a form of colonial subjugation. In this sense, the neutral science of the non-Roma expert is to be taken as read, it's to be accepted, whilst the biased activism of the native is to be queried, problematised, and rendered intellectually lacking. Section 3, the contemporary reality. In this final brief section, I want us now to think about and consider the immediate situation we're all in, and how this relates to Roma knowledge production. It strikes me that we're at a really critical moment in our connected and shared global history. We keep hearing the new normal and unprecedented times, but is this really the case? In many ways, it is very abnormal times that we're living in, but it is one with a precedent. That is, it's reminded me of how various theorists and scholars wrote about a critical turn in social sciences in the late 1960s, a time when new social movements were emerging and they were daring to claim space in a mainstream table of society. For example, we saw the advancement of feminist thought and emancipatory direct action work. We saw the impact of Stonewall, debates on sexual liberation, debates on sexual justice and citizenship rights. We also think about the civil rights movement, of course, and the importance of getting a seat on the bus as much as a space at the table. And we think about the disability lobby and emerging public expressions of discrimination in access and treatment of persons with disabilities. The original source, of course, of the cry, "Nothing about us without us." Underlining much of this action was progressive social and legislative change. In the UK context, you can't help but think of Roy Jenkins as Labour Home Secretary between 1965 and 67. He achieved so much in a very brief period of time in helping to drive the UK towards a more progressive, a more just, a more liberal society. But the pressure for those changes came from the social movements, not from the government. And likewise in Romani studies, we must feel the impact of wider decolonisation efforts across North American and European universities, as well as the work on the streets, as much as the work in universities. We think of Black Lives Matter and the Me Too movement and other social justice campaigns, the environmental lobby as well. We've seen how innovative North American work, for example, in critical race theory, in post-colonialism, in decolonisation studies, has been relevant to and deeply inspired by and for Roma scholarship in Europe and beyond. We can see that in many ways, the critical turn that occurred in Rromani studies has been due to this exclusion enacted by Gagé scholars to topics such as racism, identity and oppression that they wanted to claim sole authorship of. Similarly, and topically, what forms can Roma knowledge production look like in times and conditions of COVID-19? What might happen, in fact, if the current conditions mean that the critical turn is derailed due to advancing neoliberalism, populism and the activity of the far right, or even, in some cases, the complete refusal to accept outcomes of democratic elections? And yes, I'm thinking about America here. At the heart of our responses, there surely needs to be a narrative of Roma intellectual liberation and emancipation. New methods and ways of working need to be found to steer a pathway around the physical and spatial barriers that have been imposed by COVID-19, in much the same way as new intellectual paradigms need to be advanced in claiming knowledge production as distinctly Roma. As communities, adaptability and sustainability has been absolutely core to survival. This must not and will not change. In conclusion, and in summary, this lecture has examined Roma knowledge production and the critical turn in Rromani studies. I would like to leave you with what I think are the 3 key points arising from this lecture, as well as 3 core questions that might act as useful discussion points moving forwards. So this lecture has argued the following. Point 1. We can define knowledge production as both theoretical and a practical awareness of the given topic and the acts of making that knowledge useful and meaningful in a private and public manner. In the Roma sense, it is Rromani control of the means of production and its accompanying intellectual liberation. This has constituted a paradigm shift in a very real sense. Point 2. There's been an evidence post-colonial critical turn in Rromani studies, and this has been driven by 3 connected things. 1. New scholars and new scholarship emerging. 2. New forums and spaces for Roma creativity and industry to occur. And point 3, an epistemological and ontological shift in what counts and what is included as knowledge production and Roma-led reinterpretations of previously Gage-controlled scholarship on Roma lives, livelihoods and experience. And thirdly, and finally, our present new realities and looking at the rise of Black Lives Matter, also Me Too, and the environmental lobby, their scholarship and activism, and also the physical and spatial restrictions of COVID-19, it means that we need to look much more now at how Roma knowledge production is both thought about in terms of that allyship and that solidarity with other social justice campaigns, but also how that knowledge production is practiced, the shift to online methods of working and creating platforms of solidarity. In moving forwards, I just want to leave you with 3 core questions, ones that I think we need to address. Question 1. How do we ensure that Roma knowledge production is accessible, inclusive and participatory across all communities and geographies, and it respects key social divisions and differences as much as similarities? Question 2. How do we convince potential allies, such as those in Black Lives Matter, in Me Too, in the environmental lobby, to associate with and join the cause of Roma knowledge production, and what will this collaboration give rise to in terms of potentially further paradigm shifts in Roma knowledge production? The final question, lastly, we know, all of us here, that establishing Rromani presence at various tables of power is challenging, it's time-consuming, it's exhausting, it's expensive, and it's fraught with emotional and health-related dangers. So what can we do better in order to nourish and protect younger activists and scholars who are coming through and are trying to enact change on all of our behalfs? Thank you for your time, thank you for your patience, and thank you for listening. I look forward to the discussion now taking place.